Fire rained from a poisoned sky as thunderhawks screamed overhead, their hulls already burning before they reached the ground. Bolter shells detonated against ruins that should have been empty, and yet the air itself seemed to recoil with pain. Space Marines advanced through ash and screaming Vox traffic, their formation breaking under impacts that left no visible enemy. Orders overlapped, cut, repeated, and died in static. This was not a battlefield prepared by strategy or fate. It was an ambush by something that had learned how war worked. Every second stretched longer than doctrine allowed, heavier than ceramite armor alone. Within minutes, the city became a slaughterhouse without walls, corridors, or mercy. Auspex readings contradicted vision. Vision contradicted memory. And memory itself began to fracture under pressure. Marines fired at movement that vanished mid-trigger pull, while brothers fell screaming from wounds that refused to exist. Blood steamed on the ground and faded, as if ashamed to remain. Fear did not announce itself loudly. It crept silently into disciplined minds, asking questions no Astartes was trained to answer. Each unanswered moment tightened the noose around reality and command alike. Vox channels filled with prayers, curses, and sudden dead silence everywhere simultaneously. Somewhere at the center of the killing zone, a captain tried to impose order with a voice already stripped of certainty. Tactical doctrines collapsed faster than buildings, and centuries of training proved insufficient against an enemy that refused definition. Time slipped. Squads reported contacts that had not yet happened, while others screamed about losses command insisted were impossible. The battle no longer progressed forward. It folded inward, consuming intent, logic, and hope with equal hunger. Even the machine spirits wailed, as if the war offended them personally. Helmets recorded everything, yet understanding slipped beyond data, and faith entirely forever lost. Reinforcements never arrived, though orbit swarmed with Imperial warships pretending nothing was wrong. Requests for clarification became pleas, pleas became confessions, and confessions dissolved into incoherent noise. Marines began to remove their helmets, desperate to see something real before death found them. What they saw was worse. The world was not corrupted. It was empty, vast, and watching, as if the battle itself were an intrusion it intended to erase. Reality bent around gunfire, swallowing cause, effect, and courage without resistance. Somewhere, an unseen intelligence measured every scream and found it insufficient. The Imperium had begun to lose this war. The last transmission did not end with heroism, defiance, or victory. It ended mid-breath, as something vast moved closer and recording systems overloaded in protest. When silence followed, it was absolute, enforced, and final. Later, archivists would search for this engagement and find nothing but gaps where data should exist. No medals were issued, no honors spoken. The battle was not classified. It was declared impossible, because to acknowledge it would be to invite its return. This was the moment the Imperium chose silence over survival. And somewhere, the war continued, unrecorded, undefeated, and waiting for witnesses willing to listen. The world had been logged as compliant, its tithes paid, its skies charted, its surface marked for nothing more than routine pacification. Astropathic choirs reported silence, not distress, and silence was common on the fringes of the Imperium. The deployment orders reflected that assumption. 3 companies of Adeptus Astartes translated from the warp with practiced precision, their arrival unchallenged, their confidence absolute. Orbital scans showed cities intact, manufacturings dormant, and defensive grids powered but unmanned. It was a dead world, but not an alarming one. Death, after all, was a familiar condition of Imperial space. What unsettled the strategos was not what the augurs revealed, but what they did not. Population markers were absent, not degraded or damaged, simply gone. No mass graves, no signs of evacuation. The planet had not suffered war, plague, or rebellion. It had been emptied. That fact was noted, filed, and ignored because the Imperium had learned to survive by advancing regardless of unease. Landing zones were established without resistance. Thunderhawks settling among silent plazas and intact hablocks that bore no signs of struggle. No broken doors, no scorched walls, no symbols of heresy or Xeno's intrusion. The absence of corruption was more disturbing than its presence would have been. Servitors deployed Auspex beacons that returned stable readings while reporting echoes that vanished when examined directly. Command dismissed these as machine spirits misaligning after warp transit. The Space Marines advanced through streets still littered with personal effects, abandoned carts, and devotional icons left standing unbroken. It was as if the population had ceased to exist mid-motion. Vox chatter remained disciplined, professional, and calm, yet beneath it lay an unspoken tension no warrior could fully suppress. Veterans felt it most keenly, the sense that the Codex had no entry for a battlefield that refused to declare itself. Still, bolters were checked, formations held, and the mission advanced, because hesitation was more dangerous than ignorance. The first anomaly occurred without sound or spectacle. Squad Helion reported reaching their objective grid, and then ceased all communication. No distress signal, no final words, no static surge. One moment they existed. The next they were absent from both Vox and Auspex. Command assumed interference and rerouted channels, but the silence persisted. A second squad was dispatched to confirm status, advancing along the same street. Their progress tracked in real time. They reached the same coordinates and halted, reporting a strange pressure in the air, like descending into deep water. Their words slowed, elongated, and then fractured into echoes of themselves. Visual feeds showed Marines standing motionless, weapons raised, before the image folded inward and collapsed. Panic did not erupt. It was restrained, professional, and lethal in its implications. 2 squads lost without engagement violated every law of warfare the Astartes understood. Command issued revised orders, spacing formations wider, advancing slower, as if caution could intimidate the unknown. The city remained silent, patient, and untouched. As hours passed, reports grew contradictory, though none described a visible enemy. Some squads encountered resistance measured only by absence, their paths shortening or lengthening without explanation. Others swore streets rearranged themselves between glances, landmarks drifting subtly out of place. Chronometers desynchronized across units, though Orbital Command insisted time remained stable. Attempts to recalibrate failed, machine spirits refusing compliance without error codes. One sergeant reported hearing Vox traffic from himself, time-stamped hours ahead, describing wounds he had not yet suffered. He was ordered to withdraw, then vanished before acknowledgement returned. The realization spread slowly, like poison seeping through reinforced bone. This was not an ambush. It was not a trap. It was an environment that rejected their presence. Fear did not manifest as terror, but as erosion, wearing down certainty grain by grain. Even faith felt distant here, the Emperor's light muted by something vast and indifferent. The Marines pressed on because retreat required acknowledging that progress no longer meant safety. By the time night fell, though the sky showed no stars to mark it, Command could no longer pretend the mission remained intact. Casualty numbers fluctuated, sometimes decreasing as if deaths were being undone, sometimes spiking without cause. Requests for orbital reconnaissance returned delayed, edited or duplicated, entire minutes missing from recorded feeds. A captain ordered a halt and received confirmation before issuing the command. The implications were not spoken aloud. The world had not merely been abandoned. It had been stripped of narrative, of sequence, of the rules that allowed events to be remembered correctly. Somewhere beyond the reach of censors and doctrine, something had decided this place no longer required witnesses. As the companies regrouped amid intact ruins and unmoving shadows, one truth became unavoidable. They had not been sent to reclaim a world. They had been allowed to enter a space that no longer belonged to reality, and the price of that permission had yet to be fully demanded. The first confirmed firefight began with bolter fire and ended without targets. Squad Vox recorded disciplined bursts, range calls, confirmation hits, yet no enemy silhouettes ever appeared on helm displays. Impacts registered against nothing, detonations blooming in empty air as if striking invisible mass. Marines advanced cautiously, chains words growling, only to feel resistance where no matter existed. One warrior was lifted from the ground by something unseen, his armor deforming inward as if grasped by colossal fingers, before he vanished entirely. No blood, no remains, only a momentary distortion where he had been. His brothers did not shout his name. They tightened formation and continued firing, because acknowledging confusion was a luxury none of them could afford. The battlefield answered their aggression with silence, a silence that absorbed violence without reaction. Auspex arrays overloaded, then recalibrated, insisting nothing hostile occupied the zone. The implications settled heavily across the squad. They were in contact with an enemy that did not need to be present to kill them. As engagements multiplied, the nature of the resistance grew clearer only in its refusal to be understood. Marines reported pressure waves that crushed armor without impact, wounds appearing beneath ceramite as if inflicted from within. Bolters jammed not from debris but from perfect, inexplicable stillness, their mechanisms refusing motion despite intact components. Flammers discharged into darkness, fire bending unnaturally, curving away from empty streets as though repelled. The enemy did not advance, retreat, or maneuver. It reacted only by erasing proximity. When squads clustered, casualties spiked. When they spread, individuals disappeared. Tactical adjustments worsened outcomes regardless of intent. Veterans began to recognize a pattern that defied logic but obeyed cruelty. This was not combat against an adversary. It was correction. The world itself responded to intrusion by removing it piece by piece, with no need for spectacle or announcement. Even the most battle-hardened warriors felt the unfamiliar weight of being judged insufficient. Command attempted to reassert dominance through escalation. Heavy weapons were deployed, Devastator squads anchoring firing lines against avenues that refused to stay straight. Lascanon beams carved through buildings, yet the ruins reassembled themselves moments later, scars fading as if ashamed to persist. A dreadnought advanced into the engagement zone, its ancient machine's spirit roaring defiance through amplified vox. It fired, struck something unseen, and paused as if listening. Its next words were not coordinates or kill confirmations, but confusion. The feed cut abruptly, replaced by static layered with distant screaming that matched no known frequency. When contact was restored, the dreadnought stood inert, armor intact, sarcophagus empty. No breach, no residue. The warrior entombed within had simply been removed. That was the moment some Marines began to understand the truth they refused to voice. Whatever they faced did not fight to win. It fought to unmake. Fear emerged not as panic, but as hesitation embedded within action. Orders were obeyed, yet every movement carried doubt. Marines flinched at shadows that did not move, at echoes of footsteps that were their own, delayed by seconds too many. Vox channels bled overlapping transmissions from different times, warnings arriving after events had already occurred. A sergeant received a casualty report naming himself, time-stamped minutes in the future, followed by confirmation of his death that had not yet happened. He laughed once, sharply, before ordering his squad forward. Moments later, his armor collapsed inward, crushing bone and gene-forged muscle without external force. His body fell, intact but hollow, organs gone as if removed by an impossible surgeon. Apothecaries refused approach, not from cowardice, but because proximity itself had become lethal. The Codex Astartes offered no guidance for an enemy that punished observation. As the battle dragged on without progression, the Marines realized they were no longer fighting for victory, but for definition. They needed proof of what they faced, something to name, classify, and report. Without that, survival became meaningless, because survival implied memory, and memory was being stripped away. Helm cam footage corrupted as it recorded, frames repeating, looping, or deleting themselves in real time. Warriors began carving marks into their armor, tallying seconds, minutes, anything to anchor themselves to sequence. Some whispered litanies not to the Emperor, but to themselves, repeating names and ranks to prevent dissolution. When Orbital Command demanded status updates, replies returned altered, stripped of urgency, as if filtered by something that found panic inconvenient. The enemy remained unseen, yet omnipresent, exerting pressure not only on flesh, but on causality itself. By the time Command acknowledged the possibility of withdrawal, the concept of direction had already begun to lose meaning, and the battlefield had learned enough about them to continue the lesson alone. The moment control finally collapsed did not arrive with single catastrophe, but with too many small impossibilities occurring at once. Orders issued from command were obeyed before they were spoken, while others arrived already outdated, referencing casualties that had not yet been acknowledged. Entire squads reported simultaneous contact across different sectors using the same Vox identifiers, as if the battlefield had begun copying voices without bodies attached. Attempts to regroup only worsened the fragmentation, Marines converging on rally points that refused to exist when reached. Some arrived to find themselves already there, staring at their own armor marked by damage they did not remember receiving. Bolter fire echoed continuously, yet ammunition counts remained unchanged, magazines full despite sustained engagement. The war had slipped its leash. It no longer obeyed sequence, authority, or intent. The Astartes were not being overwhelmed by force, but by the removal of structure itself, the invisible scaffolding that allowed battle to function as battle. When the enemy finally revealed itself in fragments, the revelation brought no clarity. Shapes emerged at the edge of perception, not advancing, but resolving briefly into form before dissolving again. They were vast, indistinct, and wrong, as the perspective itself struggled to accommodate them. Marines who looked directly at these manifestations experienced immediate neurological trauma, blood pouring from eyes and ears, as their minds rejected what vision imposed. Others heard voices layered beneath Vox traffic, not taunts or threats, but statement of fact describing their deaths with calm precision. Entire firing lines turned their weapons on phantoms only they could see, cutting down brothers who moved too slowly to escape the hallucinations. Chaplains roared catechisms of purity, their faith unwavering, yet even their words fractured, repeating phrases out of order, looping endlessly until meaning dissolved. For the first time since their creation, Space Marines fought not to defeat the enemy, but to preserve their own perception of reality. The breaking point came when orbital support was finally authorized and catastrophically misapplied. Targeting data from the surface contradicted itself. Coordinates overlapping friendly and hostile zones without distinction. A land strike was approved to relieve pressure on a beleaguered company, its beam punching through atmosphere with surgical precision. It struck true, annihilating the designated grid in blinding light. When the glare faded, the company still stood exactly where it had been, untouched, while the city kilometers away burned instead. Moments later, the same strike registered again, as if repeated, this time obliterating a position already abandoned hours earlier. The sky itself seemed uncertain where to deliver violence. Marines watched bombardments fall upward, detonations blooming briefly before collapsing back into nothing. One captain, voice hoarse with strain, ordered all units to cease movement entirely. The battlefield responded by killing those who obeyed first, as if punishing stillness more harshly than resistance. Brotherhood, the bedrock of the Adeptus Astartes, began to erode under the strain of impossible conditions. Marines accused one another of corruption, of being echoes or false copies inserted by the enemy. Gene scanners returned inconsistent results, identifying warriors as deceased while they still spoke and fought. A squad executed one of their own after Auspex declared him non-existent, only to watch his body continue firing for several seconds after death, Bolter roaring with blind loyalty. Others refused to engage anything at all, lowering weapons and standing rigid, hoping inaction might render them invisible. It did not. The enemy adjusted without effort, removing them gently, almost mercifully, from existence. No explosions, no screams, just absence where certainty had been. Command structures collapsed as officers died, reappeared, then died again in different orders. Rank lost meaning when memory could no longer be trusted to hold it in place. By the time the request for exterminators was transmitted, it carried none of the solemn finality doctrine promised. It was a desperate attempt to impose an ending on a war that refused to conclude. The signal was acknowledged, logged, and denied with chilling efficiency. The reason given was procedural, citing insufficient confirmation of enemy classification. The irony was not lost on those still capable of thought. They were being annihilated because they could not explain what was killing them. As the denial echoed through fractured Vox channels, something shifted across the battlefield, a subtle tightening, as if the world itself had taken offense. Casualties spiked simultaneously across all sectors, Marines collapsing as gravity inverted briefly within their armor. The enemy did not celebrate. It did not advance. It simply continued methodical and absolute, erasing resistance and recording nothing. In that moment, the Imperium lost control, not because it was defeated, but because the concept control no longer applied. The war had transcended victory, and the Space Marines were trapped inside a process that no longer required their participation to proceed. When the Inquisition arrived, it did not come with reinforcements, relief, or questions. It came with authority so absolute that even orbital command fell silent in its presence. Black ships translated into position without broadcast, their arrival logged only after the fact, as if reality itself adjusted to accommodate them. Orders were issued that contradicted all previous directives, and yet they were obeyed instantly, not because they were understood, but because refusal felt impossible. Surviving Space Marines were ordered to hold position and cease all attempts at engagement, exploration, or withdrawal. The battlefield, as if sensing a change in hierarchy, grew unnaturally still. Casualties slowed, not out of mercy, but as though the process had reached a satisfactory threshold. Inquisitorial savants began extracting data directly from damaged cogitators and helm recorders, their faces hardening as footage corrupted even as it was reviewed. What little remained intact induced nausea, seizures, and hemorrhaging in unaugmented observers. Some records simply ended mid-frame, Marines frozen in motion before dissolving into static. Others showed events that did not correspond to any known physical law. The conclusion was reached quickly and without debate. This was not a war meant to be understood. Survivors were detained, not as heroes, but as contaminants. Apothecaries were executed after reporting anomalous gene seed readings that shifted between scans. Chaplains were isolated, interrogated, and silenced when their testimonies contradicted one another despite identical recollections. The Space Marines themselves began to fracture under questioning, recounting mutually exclusive versions of the same moments with equal conviction. Some insisted the enemy spoke through them. Others claimed it never existed at all, that the world had simply decided they were unnecessary. One veteran sergeant described standing alone in a city that stretched infinitely in all directions, fighting for days without firing a shot, while his armor slowly filled with dust from the inside. The Inquisition did not argue. They listened, recorded, and marked each account for erasure. Those deemed unstable were executed immediately, their deaths logged as combat casualties retroactively assigned to earlier phases of the engagement. Those deemed stable were subjected to deeper scrutiny, their minds probed for echoes that might persist beyond physical survival. Stability, it was determined, was more dangerous than madness. Data purges began while the battle technically still raged. Astropathic messages were intercepted and rewritten, fleet logs edited to remove references to the system entirely, cartographic records adjusted subtly, star charts smoothing over the planet's location as if it had never occupied that space. Requests for reinforcement were traced, then nullified at their origin. Entire chains of command disciplined for errors they could no longer remember committing. The world was reclassified, not as lost, but as non-existent, a designation reserved for threats that could not be allowed narrative presence. Even the Mechanicus complied without protest, their forge lords agreeing that certain machine spirits must never be permitted to learn what had transpired. Servitors who had recorded too much were dismantled, their memory cores reduced to inert slag. The silence that followed was not the absence of information, but its active suppression, a force applied continuously to ensure nothing leaked through. Inquisitors understood the risk. Knowledge of this battle did not merely inform. It invited attention. To remember was to signal. To record was to acknowledge, and acknowledgement, in this case, was an act of summoning. The final decision concerned the world itself. Exterminatus was reconsidered, then dismissed, not because the planet was salvageable, but because destruction would leave evidence. A dead world could be studied. A shattered one could be mourned. This place required something far more absolute. Atmospheric processors were sabotaged, tectonic stabilizers disengaged, and containment fields seeded with anomalies designed to discourage approach without drawing interest. The planet was not destroyed. It was isolated, wrapped in layers of denial, its existence reduced to a statistical error. Any vessel approaching too closely would experience navigational drift, instruments subtly guiding them away without alarm. Those who resisted would encounter bureaucratic obstacles, orders rerouted, missions reassigned, curiosity diluted until intent evaporated. The battlefield was left behind, not because it was finished, but because it no longer required observers. Whatever process had begun there continued, unchallenged, unmeasured, and unopposed. The Imperium did not flee in defeat. It withdrew its gaze, accepting ignorance as the only viable defense. In the sealed archives of the Ordo, a final report was compiled and immediately sealed under sanction that predated the Imperium itself. It contained no tactical analysis, no recommendations for future engagements. Its conclusion was brief and absolute. The enemy could not be classified because it did not seek conquest, corruption, or annihilation in any form the Imperium recognized. It sought removal not of life but of relevance. Those who fought it were not defeated. They were invalidated. The battle was erased because to allow it a place in history would grant it context, and context was a foothold. The surviving Space Marines were reassigned, their memories altered, their records amended to reflect honorable service elsewhere. Yet some nights, they awoke screaming, convinced they were still standing in empty streets, fighting a war that refused to end. The Imperium called the operation closed. The Inquisition called it contained. But deep within the silence they enforced, the truth remained unchanged. The battle was not too horrifying to record because of what it did to those who fought it. It was too horrifying because it proved that some wars do not need witnesses to continue. The last transmission was not discovered through official channels, nor preserved by any sanctioned archive. It survived because it was overlooked, buried beneath corrupted data fragments deemed unsalvageable by cursory review. A damaged Vox beacon, fused into the rubble of a nameless structure, continued to broadcast on a narrow frequency long after all Imperial assets had withdrawn. It carried no identifier, no timestamp, no authentication code. Only a voice, steady at first, speaking as though reporting to an audience that might never exist. The speaker identified himself by name, rank, and lineage, repeating the information more than once, as if afraid it would be stripped away mid-sentence. He described standing alone, his squad gone, his chronometer shattered, his ammunition untouched. Around him, the city stretched endlessly, unchanged by bombardment or battle, pristine and empty. He did not sound wounded. He sounded observant, almost calm, as though narration itself had become a means of resistance. The transmission looped irregularly, fragments repeating with slight variations, suggesting time had lost patience with linearity. Still, the voice continued, refusing silence, anchoring itself to speech as the last proof of existence. As the message progressed, the tone shifted subtly, not toward panic, but toward clarity. The Marine described encounters not with enemies, but with absences that behave with intent. He spoke of moments where he felt himself thinning, memories fading at the edges, names losing weight and meaning. He described watching his own shadow detach and lag behind him, mimicking movements seconds too late. At one point, he addressed someone directly, though no reply was recorded, asking if they could still hear him, if he was still real. He noted that his armor's internal systems continued to function flawlessly, sustaining a body that felt increasingly unnecessary. Pain was absent, hunger irrelevant. Only awareness remained, sharp and isolating. The Marine realized then that survival had ceased to be the objective. The battle was not about killing him. It was about waiting until he no longer mattered. His voice faltered for the first time as he admitted this, not in fear, but in understanding. He was not dying. He was being forgotten. Later segments of the transmission became fragmented, sentences breaking apart as if the language itself were under strain. The Marine described seeing others again, not as they had been, but as echoes, repeating final actions endlessly. A brother firing into empty space, another kneeling in prayer that never concluded. They did not acknowledge him. They were impressions, not people, preserved by whatever force governed the place. He wondered aloud whether this was what victory looked like for the enemy, a battlefield reduced to looping artifacts, stripped of consequence. He speculated that the Imperium's refusal to record the war was not cowardice, but instinctive self-preservation. To define the enemy would be to accept its terms. To remember would be to participate. His breathing grew uneven as he spoke, not from exertion, but from the effort of maintaining coherence. He repeated the Emperor's name once, softly, not as a plea, but as a test. The words sounded thin in the air, as if the world struggled to retain it. In the final audible portion, the Marine's voice weakened, stretched, as though distance rather than injury claimed it. He stated that something was approaching, not physically, but conceptually, a pressure that made thoughts feel optional. He apologized, not for failing his mission, but for continuing to speak, for leaving a trace that might draw attention. He expressed hope that the message would never be heard, that it would decay into noise and static, spare the indignity of comprehension. His last coherent sentence was not a warning, but an observation. The war was still happening, he said, repeating itself endlessly, because repetition required no witnesses. Battles fought without record never ended. They simply persisted, refining themselves, learning patience. His voice faded after that, dissolving into a low hum that carried no words, only presence. The beacon continued to transmit for an unknown duration before falling silent, not from damage, but because there was nothing left to broadcast. When the signal was finally isolated and destroyed, no report was filed. The officers involved agreed without discussion that nothing would be gained by preservation. The transmission did not reveal weaknesses, strategies, or avenues of defense. It offered only confirmation of something the Imperium already feared but could not confront. Some conflicts could not be won, only ignored, and ignoring them was not denial but survival. The world remained sealed, its coordinates smoothed away, its existence reduced to a blank space between stars. Yet occasionally, astropaths reported fleeting impressions, half-formed echoes of battle, without images or names. These were dismissed as fatigue, quietly reassigned, gently erased. Officially, the war never happened. Unofficially, it never ended. Somewhere beyond record and remembrance, a battlefield persisted, unchanged and undefeated, waiting not for armies, but for attention. And as long as silence held, the Imperium endured, balanced precariously on the understanding that some horrors were too complete to be allowed history at all. Long after the system was struck from star charts and its name dissolved into administrative silence, traces of the war continued to surface in ways that defied explanation. Rogue astropaths reported dreams of cities with no inhabitants, streets echoing with bolter fire that never produced smoke or ruin. Navigators spoke of regions in the warp where time stalled, where echoes of battle repeated without variation, trapped in a loop that refused decay. These reports were quietly suppressed, their authors reassigned or sedated, their experiences attributed to fatigue or psychic overstimulation. Yet the pattern persisted. The Imperium could erase records, reroute fleets, and silence witnesses, but it could not fully sever the consequences of what had been allowed to begin. Somewhere beyond sanctioned knowledge, the war endured as a fixed phenomenon, not progressing, not concluding, simply existing in defiance of narrative closure. The nature of that persistence was never fully understood, only inferred through absence. The world no longer responded to probes or scans, not because it was shielded, but because it no longer behaved as a location should. Attempts to approach its former coordinates resulted in navigational anomalies that guided vessels away without triggering alarms. Crews experienced moments of lost time, discovering hours had passed without memory or record. Some returned convinced they had seen something vast moving just beyond perception, not hostile, not curious, but patient. The Inquisition classified these incidents as peripheral bleed-through, a residual effect of exposure to a phenomenon that had not been resolved so much as ignored. The war had not spread, but it had not been contained either. It lingered, self-sustaining, requiring no reinforcement, no escalation, only the space to continue unobserved. Among the few space marines who survived and were permitted to live, fragments of the truth resurfaced in moments of weakness. Nightmares plague even the most disciplined minds, dreams where battles resumed exactly where they had left off, unchanged by time or memory. Some awoke convinced they were still fighting, their hands reaching for weapons long absent. Apothecaries recorded elevated stress responses without physical cause. Gene seed reacting as if the body remembered something the mind was forbidden to hold. These warriors served on, their records pristine, their loyalty unquestioned, yet something in them had been altered. They had glimpsed a form of war that did not seek victory, only continuity, a conflict that existed independent of armies, ideology, or will. The Imperium taught them to forget, but forgetting did not undo what had been learned. It only ensured it could never be shared. And so the war remains, not as a campaign or crusade, but as a silent concept beyond the edges of Imperial awareness. It does not threaten worlds, raise banners, or demand acknowledgement. It simply continues, refining itself in isolation, unburdened by witnesses or opposition. The Imperium endures because it refuses to look back, because it understands, perhaps instinctively, that some truths erode the foundations they rest upon. To remember this war would be to grant it meaning, and meaning would give it reach. Silence is not ignorance here, but armor. As long as the battle is not named, not recorded, not understood, humanity survives another day. Yet somewhere beyond history and hope, the war that was too horrifying to record still exists, undefeated, unchallenged, and waiting for the moment someone decides that knowing is worth the cost.